Hi, this is The Edge, and this is Close to the Edge, and I'm here with Mr. David Byrne. David, it's so great to have you as a guest on our U2X radio channel. We are very excited. We're still figuring it all out, but it's really great that you are on the show, and I'm very excited. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out. It's very flattering. This is exciting.
It's a great medium. I grew up, as I'm sure you did, on radio, and there is something about the fact that it's dedicated, or most of it is dedicated to music, that gives it a very different quality to so many other media, which obviously lend themselves to, other forms. But I think a lot of people like you and I fell in love with music that didn't form bands, ended up either in record labels or DJs or working in radio. So whenever we would, as a band, go around the country, and we did a lot early on to college stations and small stations all over America, there was always that sense that you were united, you were with your tribe, the tribe of music fans. So I still have a real soft spot for radio, and particularly I think in this age where everything is like artificial intelligence, the fact that it's curated still, like real people sit down and make real decisions about what songs they're going to play and how it's all going to be put together. So it's got qualities that I think are really important to hold on to myself. So let's kick up. When you go on Wikipedia and look up David Byrne, it comes up with David Byrne, singer, songwriter, musician, record producer, artist, actor, writer, music theorist, and filmmaker, which is a kind of unbelievably impressive list. Do you think of yourself as an overachiever?
Once in a while, I think, David, you need to get out more. But most of the time, no, I'm really having a good time.
Well, you sort of strike me like myself and my dear friend Bono as being somebody who suffers from the tyranny of the great idea, and you will probably know what that is like. There's something that happens, particularly when you're successful in an area of your life. People will listen to you and they will take you seriously, and that's wonderful mostly. But when it comes to putting forward ideas, there's times in the past I look back and I go, I wish somebody had just said, Edge, will you just get a grip? That is an absolute stinker of an idea. It's never going to go anywhere, and just stick with what you really are good at, which is writing songs, playing guitar, and writing music generally. But I have to say, in your case, mostly that support and being taken seriously has produced some incredible stuff, and I'm just blown away by what you've achieved over the years. I mean, obviously, starting with Talking Heads and that amazing success, but it seems like you've been pretty fearless in going after the things that do interest you and have pretty much pulled them all off. I mean,
There's been failures, of course, or things that I worked on for a long time and then never happened. And sometimes when I look back on it, I go, I'm glad that never happened, because it actually, it was not really ready. Yeah.
Right.
It was not fully cooked. Yes, I've been very lucky that I've managed to kind of persevere on a lot of oddball projects that allow me to be engaged in lots of different things. And then I can go back to songwriting, playing and performing and doing that as well. But I think I've always liked having little breaks from it so that I can come back a bit refreshed, borrow something from something else that I've learned.
Right. Well, I completely relate to that, and I know Bono also would feel that all of the extracurricular activities that he's involved with, they add a different sensibility, and it's all kind of makes the work, the music, more interesting. It doesn't take away. I remember we did take a year off sometime in the 90s, came back, and it was kind of shocking how we were sort of out of training, and we suddenly realized, oh, wow, this songwriting thing, it isn't quite like riding a bike. You can actually find it more difficult to get into the zone if you haven't been putting in the hours and the time. But overall, I mean, looking at your work, I mean, the opposite's the case. I think you're writing songs as good as anything you've ever written. I particularly love the record you did with Byrne recently. I'm kind of blown away by how many different areas you've been able to master. And the most recent, of course, is your show on Broadway, American Utopia. It's the sort of thing that only you could have created. The idea that it's real people on stage playing in an ensemble, but everybody's also dancing, and you've pulled it off. I mean, I don't know how you did. I mean, how did that idea get going?
Well, thank you. Well, elements of it kind of go a ways back. With the record that I'd done with Byrne, I did a tour after that one. I had 3 dancers on the tour, and I had some backing singers, and the Who also became dancers. I was starting to add kind of movement and choreography. Then I did a tour with St. Vincent. There was a lot of brass players, and they moved around. So I was kind of moving in this direction of having not just dancers, but having the musicians move around in patterns and do shapes and this and that. And I thought, how far can this go? Can I go all the way to having everyone be mobile? Mm-hmm. Can we take the drum kit apart like you would do in New Orleans on a second line group, or samba school, or other kinds of things, where each part of the kit is, say, played by a different player, and how many players would that take to do that? In our case, it was 6. And would that work? Can they play together, or is it going to sound a mess? So then it became the big idea. Yes, the big idea. Can this be done? And how do we do it? And how much is it going to cost? Can I afford to do this? That's more musicians than I've carried in a while, but can I afford to do that? It turns out my agent said, "Oh yes, David, you can afford to do that. You're having a Leonard Cohen moment," which he didn't mean that my voice had dropped and I was writing very sexy songs. He meant that in my absence, there was interest in seeing me perform live. That was the Leonard Cohen moment. So yeah, just pushed ahead on that, and it turned out that there was technology that made this possible. I thought, okay, that means the stage can be empty. We can take away all the, I mean, you guys do this too, where the amps are hidden and all that. We don't see all the clutter. And so I thought, okay, we can remove that. So that means that it's just us. It's just us. Everything that the audience sees is just us and moving what we do. So that's what it became. And I eventually discovered that we could use a very lightweight aluminum chain to make a kind of curtain that defines the playing area. Because I thought there's no sense in clearing an empty space if you can see all this crap all around the edges. Monitor mixers and crew and lighting people or whatever else, it's all got to be hidden. So it's in the empty space, it's only us. So that kind of worked. Speaking of stage stuff, on an earlier, wasn't a tour that I was doing, it was a musical that I had done. I approached someone who worked with you, S. Devlin. I approached her because she'd done incredible work with you in the theater. Some of the theater stuff she'd done, just incredible stuff. So I said, I'm going to do this musical about Joan of Arc, and I want you to think about that. It never worked out. Worked out. Everything I aim for, I don't hit. But
well, I love the Sam Beckett idea that when asked to give artists advice, he said, fail better. And I always think that that's a great reassurance, because clearly if you are putting yourself out there and you are trying new things and taking risks, you're occasionally going to wipe out. There's no way that you're not. And anyone who is scared of wiping out is never going to take any risks. So it's a choice. You either accept that sometimes it's not going to happen, or you just play it safe. And I don't think any artist of any real value ever plays it safe. So I'm just working on the assumption that all our favorite artists have had massive failures, most of which probably never see the light of day. Although I did once, there was an exhibition of Picasso, which was quite fascinating. We caught it in the south of France. It was a few years ago. And it was all the paintings that he never wanted anyone to see. I guess when he had passed away, his estate sold them all off, and they became this this kind of traveling show. Not that it was billed as that, but if you're a Picasso fan, you could tell very easily that these were just his kind of run-of-the-mill works. They weren't bad as such, but compared to his masterpieces, they were really sort of mediocre. And it was a great encouragement to me, because I just went, wow, here's Picasso. And he is clearly having to pick and choose what the public see and what goes into museums. And it's really just a case of being very, very selective. And I took a lot of encouragement from that idea.
Yeah, so we think he's better than he is because we only see the good stuff.
Yeah, which is, by the way,
that's fair.
It's
that's
fair. I don't see.
You're allowed to do that.
Oh, I mean, not every U2 song sees the light of day, and we try and be as selective as we can. In fact, I think it's that process of being selected that probably is, in the end, the biggest influencer of your work. Is somebody who puts everything out is less likely, I think, to connect. If you really are tough on your work, we're relentless in our pursuit of bringing something through to kind of nth degree. Your process, I don't know, I mean, has it changed over the years? I read interviews early on where you used to, for instance, write a lot of songs in parts, and you'd kind of find little sections that would work together, and you'd create your songs in that way, of like a patchwork quilt. But I don't know if that is true even, but that was a little vignette I picked up from your early interviews.
That is true, and at some point I discovered that there's all sorts of ways to write songs. That I could write out some lyrics and then put music to the lyrics. I could have a few chords and a groove and then come up with a melody and words over top of that. So the words, I think, comes last. I've done now a couple of musicals, and with those, you're wedded to a character and a moment in the story that you have to tell. That this is what's happening at this moment, and this is what that person's feeling. So you have to tell that. So the words generally then have to come first,
right?
Because you have to say what you have to say there. Which I thought, oh, okay, because there was a long period where the words were coming last. And sometimes I can write a song that's, for me, fairly linear. For it's telling a story, and you can tell where it's going, and it all makes some sort of logical sense. And then I've written songs that are, some of which are some of the most popular ones I've written, that really don't make much logical sense at all. And they make a kind of emotional sense. The way the words sound maybe affects people emotionally, and it sounds right. But if you look at just logically what it's saying, sometimes it's just a lot of non sequiturs.
Yeah. As a guy who approaches music from a completely sort of naive, instinctual place, I have to say that doesn't bother me at all, because I think of music lyrics as much more like poetry than prose, where it's a suggestion, and the emotion is not just the pure content, it's how it lands on the chords and the melodic line and the intensity of the vocal, and it's so much more suggestive. The content is delivered on many different levels, and I think a great song operates on levels that defy explanation. And so, for instance, one of our songs, One, if you just looked at the lyric on the page, it's pretty evident that it's a kind of very nasty row between family members. As we were putting the lyric together, it was a kind of, we created this scenario in our heads. The song people decide to have played at their wedding, and situations where it would just be completely inappropriate, except for the fact that there's some sort of powerful emotion in that combination of words and melody that is a new thing. And that's, I think, why music still is so inspiring and confounding and challenging, is that it's so hard to explain or predict. When something collides and you get a moment, a thing, it kind of is undeniable. You can have a lot of different opinions about, paintings or food, but it's funny about songs. There are great ones, the ones that just, for whatever reason, just work. And it's mysterious.
When you found out that song was being received that way, very different than the story that you just told of what inspired the song, did you decide that you needed to correct people's impressions of the song and felt like, oh, we've we've failed. They're not hearing the real story, and we have to make that plain and clear what the song is really about? Or did you feel like, no, let them make of it what they will and make it work for them?
I think we were surprised, but in no way offended, or in no way thought there was something going on that we couldn't endorse or approve of. Quite the opposite, we were just sort of blown away. And we wondered, I suppose, I mean, I always kid Bono. I say, well, Bono, no one listens to lyrics. You know that. They just listen to... And I think I borrowed that phrase from Brian Eno, because Brian, would talk about some of his favorite music having lyrics that he didn't like or couldn't agree with, but it didn't matter to him. So Brian, is probably still at least an agnostic, if not an atheist, but he loved gospel music. And we go to gospel churches in New York. He was such a fan. But the sentiments and the lyrics was not the thing that was moving him. It was whatever the combination was. So I guess we came to terms with that and went, yeah, it's fine. Once the song is out there, you no longer own it. It's like it's the property of everybody who makes it part of their life. And the way they interpret it and what they're hearing and what they're picking up is really personal to them. It kind of doesn't matter what was going on in your head at the time. It's much more important how fans of that song respond to it, what they're getting from it.
So you think sometimes the story that you told of the kind of family disagreement or family misunderstanding, those kind of things can be, say, a kind of Kickstarter to get the song underway, and then sometimes they might be abandoned? I think in the same way that you might abandon an early guitar part or something like that and go, okay, that got us to the place where it's a song, but it doesn't work in the song anymore.
Yeah, or sometimes you might get I agree with that. I think that is definitely has happened with some songs where, you've established a certain sort of idea which you're building on, and then the song itself just... it's like a rocket, just takes off, and it's suddenly a new and completely different thing, and the original idea is no longer relevant. That's true. But you can also get a situation where you've changed the song, but there's something about a moment, a melodic idea or lyric idea that still works in the context of this new version for reasons that you couldn't begin to explain, and you would never have arrived at that musical idea or lyric idea thought if you were approaching it from this new perspective. So I know, it's so mysterious. There's a backing vocal that I sing in Beautiful Day, which is in the middle of a certain part of the song. I just sing Always. And the reason I sing Always is because the previous version of that song was a song called Always, and it was just my harmony vocal. At some point in the mixing of the new version called Beautiful Day, somebody left that channel up and people went, wow, what's that? Do that again. That was amazing. And so my backing vocal ended up being part of the mix. And then evermore, every time we played that song live, for no apparent reason, no lyrical reason, just some sort of bizarre musical reason, I sing Always in the middle of this song. So I think in my experience, it's about being awake when something occurs that's changing the molecules in the room and recognizing something's happening, and wow, jump on that. And it's like, various people have talked about it. I think Quincy Jones talks about it as waiting for God to walk through the room. I would never be quite so presumptuous, but the idea is that sometimes when you're dealing with music, something collides and it just comes together. And I'm sure with your projects, that your shows, like, I'm fascinated by the addition Helge Tomba, the Janelle Monáe and Wonderland artist put in American Utopia. It's just Eric Gardner, say his name. Trayvon Martin, say his name. Sean Bell, say his name. So how did you come across that? And what was the sort of motivation to put that in the show? I think it's a brilliant thing to do.
I'd heard that song maybe a year or so before we started putting our show together, and I thought it was one of the most moving protest songs I'd ever heard. I was completely knocked out. And I felt that, in a way, what was amazing about it was that it says, remember these lives. Remember these lives that have been taken from us. Here they are. These are people. Each one is a person. So instead of talking about an issue or a policy or abstract ideas, it's taking you right to a person. This is a person that has been taken from us. One minute they were alive and now they've been murdered. So in a lot of our shows, often we would end with an encore, a cover version of somebody else's song as an encore, and it was usually done for fun.
Right.
And it's kind of a throwaway. It's a lot of fun. The audience is having fun, and it's kind of like a good send-off. In this case, I thought times have changed, and I don't know if I can just throw away something lighthearted at the end. I think it's time where we have to kind of make our feelings known. Everybody has to be vocal about what's happening in the world. Our responsibility as citizens is beyond just voting and paying taxes. It tends to having our voice be heard. So I thought, let's try this. I wrote to her, of course, and said, what do you think of an older white guy singing this song?
Right.
I'd met her before, and she loved the idea. She said, yeah, his song should be heard by as many people as possible. And we did keep it at the end, because it is the kind of thing that's kind of like the audience is celebrating and they're all dancing and having a great time. And then it comes as a kind of a punch in the gut and a reminder, this is the world we live in. It's not all just partying and dancing.
I mean, prophetic, because, I mean, you had no idea back then how events were going to kick off in America and how Black Lives Matter, from being a sort of important, timely movement, was suddenly going to be like the story of the world. It's amazingly prescient, that choice of song. And I know you've got shows coming up in September. Has it been a big surprise to you that things have escalated so quickly around this issue?
Yeah, the frustration is not a surprise. I mean, because so very, very little has changed. And so that frustration, I just go, wow, just no wonder people are just fed up. But the fact that these recent protests and marches and awareness spread around the whole world, that I don't think has happened before, and not in the same way. I read somewhere we said, yes, there were protests and uprisings when Rodney King was beaten some years ago in Los Angeles. But it kind of was confined to Los Angeles. And there was marching in Ferguson when Michael Brown was killed. But it was kind of confined to there and a few other places. This just started happening everywhere. And it was kind of like, this is enough. So that is kind of heartening in itself, especially if something can come of it.
That's the point, I suppose. So do you think, because I think there's two ways to look at it. One is, this could either be like a kind of healthy group therapy session where things are coming out and there's a genuine desire to make amends and really address these issues, or that it's a kind of offshoot of this tribalism that seems to be happening in many parts of the world, where people are retreating into their kind of positions and into their little groups. So are you generally optimistic? Do you think that this is a positive thing, or are you concerned that it's actually going to worsen this sort of instinct for tribalism?
Probably a little bit of both. I'm optimistic because in my professional life I can talk to people about diversity and inequality and other kinds of things, and now it's a conversation that we can have. Whether things really happen, it's another story, but we can have that conversation, and it's, I'm not just kind of told to go away and stop being so idealistic. It's people realize, no, this is serious. This is something that has to be addressed now. So that seems pretty good. But I also, as you're saying, in moments when things are going to change, people are going to fight back. There's always going to be a tribe that goes, no, we like things the way they were, or the way we imagined they were, or we don't want things to change and be different. We haven't seen the end of that.
Right. The way that, I mean, we are famously, I think, being Irish probably is a large part of it. We are fans of America, the concept. And when we think of America, we think of it as John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, we think of it as Abraham Lincoln, we think about it as the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. That's America to us. But there is another side of America, clearly, the one that George Jackson spelt with a K. And it's not that. It's much more about, the land grabs and the, capitalism run amok. So we sort of look upon this as maybe America is almost at the moment where it really will live up to its creed and its idealistic concepts, as Martin Luther King said. And so we, as in you two, definitely still firmly believe in what America's about. But are people in America starting to doubt it? I mean, do you believe in America as a concept? Do you think it can work?
I think it's gone off the rails considerably, but quite a few of the basic ideas are really wonderful. And it's this incredible experiment that happened and that is, I hope, worth pursuing. Mm-hmm. But like you said, there's an awful lot to be fixed. I mean, this is a country built on slavery. Yeah. And the riches of this country and the wealth of this country were built on other people's backs. Mm-hmm. And that has to be acknowledged. And it has to be acknowledged that we're not as squeaky clean as we would like to think. And there has to be a kind of truth and reconciliation within the United States. I think it's pretty hard to move forward, really, until something like that happens. The step to healing is to admit what's going on and to look history straight in the eye and say, this is what we did, this is what really happened.
Right.
And for that to become part of the national story and not swept under the rug. I would like to think that can happen. I sense that is beginning to happen.
Right. Well, I mean, I can see how when you go into that song at the end of your show in September, this is going to have a whole other resonance. I'm sure it has always, but this is like such a powerful piece now. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, it's fairly heartbreaking. Yeah.
And unfortunately, you got some new names to add to the list.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Can I ask you about Ireland?
Yeah.
From this side of the pond, Ireland looks very enlightened. I know there's problems, but
yeah,
of course we're looking at anything that's better than where we are ourselves right. over here.
Well, I would have to say
I'm curious how people in Ireland feel about their own situation.
I think people are a little frustrated with the economics, but not across the board. I would say Ireland is now part of the global economy, and as we get more and more part of an international marketplace, particularly when it comes to property and whatever, it's having issues for some people in a socio-economic group that probably would have been able to buy a house 20, 30 years ago, but now it's like it's almost impossible, and yet rents are very high. So those sort of pressures are frustrating for people, and the government have been criticized for maybe not acting as dynamically as they should. But other than that, other than those sorts of problems, I think Ireland has really gone through an incredible transformation in a very short space of time, and has taken a leap into a future where the population feel like they do not want to have anyone else inputting into their control of their destiny. And I'm thinking particularly of the Catholic Church, which for generations, centuries, was such a massive influence on Ireland and the Irish. I think Ireland has leapt into the 21st century in terms of sort of issues, social issues particularly, and surprised itself. I don't think anyone would have imagined that, 10 years ago, if you'd looked to this era, that Ireland would have, ratified marriage between people of the same gender. So gay marriage was brought in unanimously.
Yeah, it makes you realize that people can change the way they think, change their attitudes. Yes.
Now that abortion is being brought in, which wasn't. 35 years ago, you couldn't get a divorce in Ireland because the Catholic Church didn't like divorce. So now it's like there's definitely a game of catch up happening. And I think there is, and the Irish have always had a particular empathy for the underdog. So our form, like our republic generally speaking, has always attempted to be as fair as possible. We could do more and we can be better, but I think there's a kind of natural social conscience at play. So capitalism hasn't ever been allowed to get too out of whack. We've been reasonably smart at curtailing the worst excesses of capitalism. So I have to say, yes, pretty happy with how things are at, and could be better, but in the wider scope of things, it's an amazing success story, and it's an amazing example of things changing very fast and people surprising themselves how quickly they can move forward. And it's interesting that in Europe and a lot of parts of the world where the far right and the populist movement is dominating politics, Ireland has gone the opposite way. It's great to see.
Full disclosure on my part, I got my Irish citizenship earlier this year.
Oh, good for you.
It took a while, but when Brexit was going on and all that stuff some years ago, I thought, okay, it's time to do this.
Oh, this is great. Well, I mean, I wanted to ask you about that because you and I have certain things in common. My father was an engineer, your father was an engineer. We moved to a part of the world where we were minorities or different. You moved a lot. I mean, you started out in Canada and then you moved to the States, and then you went to college in RISD famously, and met some of the guys from Talking Heads, the Chris and Tina. But then you seemed to you made up your mind New York was the place for you. Is that still home? Is that still the place where you feel works for you?
Wow. I mean, right now, during the virus and everything, that's the question everyone is asking. Why do we need big cities? What's the advantage of a big city anymore? Traditionally, it's been a place where you could get inspired by, meet other people, see what other people were doing, see a show or run into people or have conversations with people that were different than yourselves or with your friends, and all those things that kind of mingling and getting together, all those advantages that they do, not just social, but their economic advantages and everything of that kind of inspiration. And now, when you can't go out and do any of those things,
right,
a lot of people are asking themselves, what are we here for? Oh, yeah. I would see, things that were happening in galleries and in clubs and musicians from uptown and downtown and coming from other countries and all this stuff. It was just like, well, it's all right there in front of you, all for the taking, all for you to kind of enjoy and be inspired by it. And it was all there if you wanted it. And to some extent it still is, but it's changed. And right now, with the fact that we can't go out and partake of any of that, yes, it has people kind of take a moment to think about it.
Right.
What's the bargain here? What's the trade-off? What are we getting? Yeah,
I know. One of our great friends, and I'm sure you knew Hal Wilner. Hal used to, and we lost him to the COVID-19 pandemic, tragically. Hal's story about arriving in New York as a young man was very interesting. He says he arrived into New York, went out on the first weekend, ended up in some dodgy bar in the Lower East Side, and came out at 1 a.m. to witness two rival hookers in a fight with broken bottles. And he just, his immediate response and impulse was go, yes, this is where I need to be. This is exactly where I want to be. And, which is one of the things we loved about Hal was he did so love, New York City for all its flaws. So my question, I suppose, is the new New York is so much more genteel, so much more safe and whatever. Do you miss that New York of the late 70s, 80s, where you could get into some serious problems if you were in the wrong part of town? Or do you think it's grown up in a good way, or has it lost some of its savor and salt?
For a young artist, musician, whatever, right now, I think it's probably a lot harder
Right.
for them. Despite some of the dangers, yeah, there's nothing positive about streets being dangerous or all the stuff that was pervasive then. There's nothing to be nostalgic about there. But the fact that the rents were so low meant that clubs and venues and galleries could just sprout out of nothing because the rent was so low. They could just open up a place and see what works. You could live in a loft or lived in an apartment, and the rent was enough so that you weren't working all day to pay the rent. You could work part-time and pay the rent. And then the rest of the time you could make your music. And eventually you could even quit that job. Those kinds of things are harder to come by now. I think that part, that's obviously not true for me, but for I think a lot of emerging and young musicians,
right,
that's a real struggle. They're asking themselves, how do I do this? How do I make my music and make a living at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, it's, that early New York scene was such an inspiration for you too. We were kids, but hearing all that music coming out of the city in the late 70s was like, we just wanted to get there as quick as possible. It was just so exciting. Everything that was happening, obviously Talking Heads, but also television and Patti Smith, Richard Hell and the Voidoids. I mean, it was pretty great. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to hang with you. Unfortunately, it's over Zoom and not face-to-face, but I'm a huge fan. I know that's true for Bono and Adam and Larry also. Huge fan of your work and always have been. We opened for you early on a number of occasions. And
I wondered if you were going to mention this.
So much from playing with you guys. I think it was the first time we really played at what I would say is a fully professional grade level was opening for Talking Heads. And,
this was like Hammersmith Palais or someplace, was it maybe?
Yep, the Hammersmith Ballet in London, but also the year before, 1979, in the Electric Ballroom. We were actually third on the bill that night, so we supported OMD. But it was so great to share a stage with you and see you guys in action. Even back then, you had this incredible ability to balance the need to be an artist and the need to be a performer. It's not a contradiction, it doesn't undermine the art to also understand that you have to be a showman. And that's an amazing thing that you always managed to do, and still do. Because American Utopia is really exactly that. And I know that there's a HBO film coming out, which I'm so looking forward to seeing. But it's hard to do, to balance that artistry and commerce. But you do. And long may it continue. Mr. David Byrne.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Been a real pleasure.
Great to talk to you too. It was really nice. Hope to see you in Dublin sometime soon.
That would be wonderful.